Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Amanda Landis-Hanna. I'm one of the co-hosts for Veterinary Business Podcast. I am really grateful to have you all here today, and I'm going to be introducing you to one of my dear friends, Nancy DeWitz, in just a couple of minutes. On this podcast, we bring you insights and expertise from industry-leading doctors, experts, and thought leaders. We cover a wide range of topics, including practice management, marketing, finance, leadership, HR, law, and much more. Whether you're a practicing veterinarian, a practice owner, a practice manager, or a student studying to be a veterinarian or veterinary technician, this podcast is tailored to help you navigate the unique challenges and opportunities in the business of veterinary medicine. Every listener of this podcast is welcome to visit us at www.veterinarybusinessinstitute.com. Again, that's www.veterinarybusinessinstitute.com. And that's all one word for Veterinary Business Institute. You're welcome to visit us for additional resources and tools to help support your growth. You can also subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, YouTube Music, Spotify, and other popular podcast platforms. Today, as I mentioned, I'm excited to speak with Nancy DeWitz. She is a consultant, and she is going to be providing us information today in regards to her business. Her business helps to provide us with opportunities to see the background of veterinary software and to see what the future holds. Thank you, Nancy, so much for joining us.
Thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here today.
Would you mind introducing yourself? I know your history and I love you dearly, so I'm so excited to introduce you to my audience.
I'm excited to be here to meet your audience. As you alluded, I've got a deep history rooted in veterinary software. I started with an IT firm almost 40 years ago, and in the very end of 1989, a veterinary software company hired me to work in their support department. And that kind of launched into my love for veterinarians and veterinary practices in general. I've spent well over 30 years, obviously, hanging out with veterinarians. And over time, I discovered that while all of my background was kind of on the IT side, not the medical side, IT was one of those things that veterinarians just tried to hand over to someone. And maybe that someone didn't even understand what that meant. So through time, I have worked for several different companies with angles all through the veterinary hospital, all related around IT. And in 2012, I started speaking at the big conferences on IT. I think I started out in Michigan, and IT wasn't something we talked about, right? It's one of those taboo elephants in the room, right? We just need to stay away from it. No, I don't want to do it. But really, that's become part of our lives over time. And so I decided to start helping veterinary practices bridge that gap, basically between a great IT group and the practice. And I can help both sides understand each other. So that's kind of what launched into this. Just there's so much out there, and how does anybody keep track of it, right? So that's where I can come in and help.
Awesome. So you're speaking a little bit about the earlier days of software use. Obviously, now it's so prolific. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the early work that you did with client communication and reminders?
Sure. When I first started, anybody that's been around since the early 90s knows that kind of the primary function of these systems in that day and time was invoicing and reminders. And that was really impactful for me when I went on my first install. And I walked into a practice and I was kind of trying to figure out how they could make the system pay for itself. I mean, back in those days, a very small hard drive was a lot of thousands of dollars, right? So how does it make it pay for itself? And the first practice I walked into, they had stacks of reminder cards in the corner, right? Stacks. And I said, wow, how long does it take you guys to get through those? And he said, oh, that's a few months worth. And instantly I thought, wow, client communication is the way to bring in dollars, right? That's how we get the care done, and the care leads into dollars. And so I was able to show them with a couple clicks of the button, boom, there's all your reminders ready to send out. Now that's back in the day when
That's
reminder printers
amazing.
made a lot of noises, right? But that was super
I remember
impactful for me.
the dot printers that
Yep,
had the little holes on the side that you
yep,
would have to pull the reminder out and fold it up and mail it.
yep. And then the reminder postcards came so you could, just peel off all the dots and get them off to the side. But that was really impactful for me in learning more about how the computers in general moving forward were going to be able to impact the relationship between the veterinarian and the pet owners. It's all about client communication and education. And that was the first step in getting that out, right?
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that initial timeline around integration. What did it look like originally? How is it changing and evolving over time?
So yeah, integration was something that, again, the computers were kind of standalone amongst themselves, doing invoicing and reminders. And IDEX was the first one to come out and say, hey, I think we should put more information into the system, right? And so they started working with the company that I was working for at the time, just trying to decide how do we integrate and how do we get them in. And as many people know, companies like IDEX and others have bought softwares in an attempt to bring as much integration into the exam room as possible. And that's all about, again, client education and client sharing. The more they could make those things visible, the better off it was going to be. Over time, that's increased in some areas, a lot more integration. Today, it's just kind of here's integration here and there and everywhere. So it's been interesting to watch it over time.
What really changed as you moved out of the 90s and with Y2K? I know everyone was worried that the computers were going to take over the world or all explode or they were all going to reset to prehistoric times. What actually happened and how did that impact how our softwares are being used now?
Yeah, Y2K was interesting because a lot of the old veterinary practice softwares ran on like Xenix. I mean, that's going way back, but all the hackers weren't really going after them. So most people's software was going to be safe. But not long after that, we started seeing some cloud companies try to come to the market. And there were a few that popped in, but the problem they ran into was infrastructure. And that's still kind of an issue today, as more and more cloud comes into play. But infrastructure was kind of the downfall of those companies because there wasn't a lot of internet everywhere. So we saw a lot of what we considered those .com companies fall off to the wayside and the servers triumphant, as they went along. So Y2K was scary for anybody running a computer. And the new companies trying to launch into that cloud-based scenario were all excited and it just didn't have the infrastructure to hold them up.
Yeah, Y2K was very interesting. I was still in vet school at the time, and we didn't walk around with our little phones attached, excuse me, our little computers attached to our phones, and with tablets in exam rooms and in vet school. So it was pretty dramatic as that started to really take over. And now we're seeing, in practices, we're seeing so many different products. So how did we go from, essentially one or two products to really sort of blossoming into this wide abundance of products?
That has been very interesting over the years. As you said, just a few products in the very beginning. I think I can probably name off 4 or 5 that were the very start of software, right? And now, when I start talking to different companies about their history, they they were born out of necessity. So someone felt that they were missing something in software, and so they teamed up with a group of people and started building software. Some companies were very successful. Others fell by the wayside, kind of trial and error sort of thing, right? So there was a lot that came in. I would say that cloud-based systems started overseas a little bit earlier than they did here in the States, and some of them have made their way over as well. But it was interesting to just kind of watch them, and each one has their unique ability or they're bright and shiny about them. A lot of them were very surface when they first started, not very deep, and they've had to morph, right? And change because the established products were very feature rich. Now, that's not saying, Amanda, that everybody used every feature on the existing products, right? That's half the battle is determining what you're actually using out of the software.
That's definitely true in practice. Because I'm a relief veterinarian and I use a lot of different softwares in a lot of different practices, I kind of have to know a little bit about all of them, but I don't necessarily have the greatest of depth of training with all of them. Now that there's so many options, how do you pick for enough options? How do you decide what the right choices are going to be for you and your practice?
Yeah, so that was what really kind of launched me. I used to sell software, right? And I would lose accounts based on a lunch. Somebody provided a better lunch than I did. It's not really a great way to pick software. Um, and so I started really looking hard at what does the practice need? Because that's what should be important. What are the things that your practice needs to succeed and be efficient with the software that you're using in the practice? There are well over 20 products on the market. How can you even know, which direction to go is generally, the original thought. And then you start adding apps and other connected things to that. It becomes quite a crowded area to try to figure out. I will start out by saying that everybody always says, "What's the perfect software?" Every talk I give. Well, I know you can't say it up on the stage, but what's the perfect software? Well, unfortunately, the software that might be right for you is not right for the clinic down the street because you have different priorities, you have different needs, different wants, right? So it's really about establishing what is that list? What is that go to? And turn it more into a data driven process than an emotional driven process because it is something that touches every nook and cranny of your practice, right? And if we just go at it and see, oh, I really liked that way that went, or I really liked that sales rep. Well, I'm here to tell you, in most cases, the software rep you fall in love with isn't who's going to be helping you. They're not who's supporting you. So you really need to go deeper than that and look at those products from a very data driven process. And just establishing, how are things done in the practice today? What are they doing? I've had practices that have like, I'm going to move to this software. And I'm like, but you're using this and they don't have it. Oh, what do you mean they don't have it? It's finding all those questions, right? Because the time you find out about it is not when you're installing, preferably, right? So, I mean, I wrote a blog one day and I think that this is the best way to describe it. We're really not looking for that perfect software because it doesn't exist. There is no perfect software that covers everybody. But what we need to do is manage the expectations at the end of the process, right? So I use a holy blue jeans as kind of an analogy. If you go to the store and you're looking to get a pair of blue jeans and you get them home and they have holes in them, you're not going to be very happy, are you? But if you went to the store with the anticipation that you were going to have holes in your blue jeans, you just needed to know strategically where they were placed, you're very happy when you get home because you wanted holy blue jeans. It's really the same way with software, right? It's managing that end expectation. And you're kind of giggling, but you know what? Honestly, that's what it's all about. It's about managing that expectation.
That's true on the other side of the exam room table as well. Veterinary technicians and veterinarians, veterinary assistants, and our customer service reps up front, all of us, our whole job is about managing those expectations. This is what's going to happen today. This is what's going to happen during your exam. This is going to be what happens when you take your pet home with medications. It's always about managing those expectations.
Yep, it truly is. And it makes for a better install in the end if you understand there will be holes. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, but it's about knowing about those holes and accepting them. Maybe you have something that's a deal breaker, but something else comes along and everything checks off except for that one item. Okay, well, is that hole still a deal breaker? Or can you live with that or change and move on? It's quite a process to go through.
Absolutely. Is that part of the reason why it can take multiple products in order to really create a very efficient office?
It can. Some of the practice management softwares do more than others, but not all of them do everything. A lot of the additional products that have come along say, well, we can do this, this, and this, and this. So people are kind of picking and choosing out of them. Some of the issue comes into when we talk integration, which products will integrate with which products. So if you've
Mm,
gone out and picked a bunch of different apps per se, and then you start looking for software, okay, well, that becomes kind of one of those questions. Does your new software work with that? Does it need to work with that? What things are left open in holes, type of scenario. So I
yeah,
think it's not every software today can really do everything, but historically softwares didn't do everything. There's just more technology that has to happen out there today. When
right.
the when the older server-based computers were out there, I mean, there was no pet apps. There weren't other things to really have to worry about.
Hmm.
Today's softwares have a lot to look at.
With all of that to look at, it definitely sounds like the staff needs to be not only fully on board, but they're going to be setting up some of this stuff. They're the ones that are going to be using it day in, day out. If I'm a hospital manager and I'm looking at this new software that has been selected for me, how do I set up the expectations for my team, but also where do they come in? Obviously, they've got a big piece of using it. Does it help to get their opinions on things?
So a lot of opinions is kind of a double-edged sword in some instances, but through the process with my practices, I encourage them to ask questions ahead of time, not after the product's been purchased, but more about upfront questions. What types of things does the staff have concerns about with the existing product? What types of things would they like to see in another product? All too often, staff is moving from practice to practice. They've had experience with other products. What did you see there? So, kind of involving them in that pre product purchase or that pre product look and making sure that that's all captured. And then as you move along, it's about setting expectations again for what the install is going to look like. And that could be practice software, that could be a new piece of technology, all sorts of things that this comes into play for. So if you think about training, sit down with whatever practice software you've picked or partner you've picked for a technology piece, and talk to them about the expectations for training and help lay that out for the staff. Today's training is not in-house most of the time. And back in the day when I used to train practices, I was on site. I could judge how someone was taking the software. I could look at that deer in the headlight look, and I'd know that that person needs extra assistance. We don't have that today, and that's on the practice to pay attention to. And so it's super important to have a plan and make sure that they kind of understand that plan going forward. And then I like to think about, what happens after it's installed, because that can be an issue too. Making sure there's standard operating procedures so that they know who to go get help from. The most time I see when I'm doing practice evals on site of wasted time is someone trying to figure out their technology, whether it was a lack of training, whether they just didn't know where to go. So all of that kind of comes into play when you're implementing something new into the hospital.
That's really a great way of kind of phrasing it. Would you mind giving me like a couple minutes on each of the main roles in the hospital and maybe some things that you might want to highlight for each of those roles between CSR or assistant, technician, veterinarian? Are there particular things that you really want to call out and spend some time with?
So let's just start at the front, right? The CSRs. What's the workflow in the practice? And so I ask that question when I'm working with a clinic. What's your workflow? What does that front staff person need to do daily with technology? Is that just checking in? Is it taking phone calls and checking in? Looking at what creates their day helps you lay out what training needs to be done, first of all, and just really helps figure out how rest of it can morph with the rest of the staff. So I was, I don't remember where I was. I presented to to basically CSRs and some technicians about how to not let technology upset your day. And one of the biggest pieces of advice I give my practices for the front end staff is make them feel empowered to be able to give you feedback if things are not going right, because that's the front base of your practice.
Yeah.
And so if things are hiccuping, they need to speak up. So then if we move a little further back in the practice and we look at the technician nurse role, something that's easy to install or easy to get information in, those types of things, because they're really in front of the client when they're trying to get this stuff done. So don't skimp on the technology that they're using. If you have an older system that's giving hiccups, get it out of their way. Don't make their day a little harder by making that older equipment, something they have to pay attention to. With today's systems, a lot of setup can be done ahead of time. So there's a lot of templating, and that really helps, whether that technician nurse is inputting for the doctor or just getting their own vitals and things like that in. Think about how they do their process when they're in room, and setting up templates accordingly will really help their day and manage their time and stress. Um, and then if we talk about the veterinarian, you're going to have some veterinarians that are totally comfortable in writing out their notes or typing out their notes in the computer. And there are others that just aren't. They don't like to type, they don't want to put them in. And I find this in a lot of practices that have gone really paperless, except for medical records. And it's generally because a veterinarian just doesn't want to do the input. And so my advice to those is look at the new technology that's out there when we're doing speech to text. And I'll readdress that in a second here. Or making sure your templates are built in such a way that they have very little that they have to input. Or even better yet, have a scribe in the room that can actually translate into the medical record what the doctor's saying. When I said I'd talk about the speech to text, I recently was part of a book project, and I thought, oh, I can talk. I'll just use the microphone in Word and I'll just talk my chapters. It took longer to edit than it did to just type it out. And so some people are super comfortable with it. Others are not. It does take work, but for those that have made it successful, they do like putting their notes in that way. So I caution people when they get one of those products, because it sounds great, but you do need to put a little work into it, right? You need to be comfortable with the technology so that what you are saying comes out on the record the way you want it to. So that's really the different things to look at. You've got all your integrations with your lab work and x-rays and all of those different things. Some systems integrate with other systems and some they don't. So that's all important questions, right? But when you're talking workflow, look ahead of time at what each of those positions are doing and address the software from that standpoint.
That's so smart. If you're a hospital manager that's really kind of focusing on what are some of the best ways to train or educate your team, do you have any best practices that you want to call out for people to keep in mind?
So I think breaking it down, right? And then not letting it drag out too far, staying on top of it as they're going through training. Because if it drags out too far, we all know that we're going to just revert to old habits. We're going to revert to old ways of doing things, and we won't pick up and learn what has to happen on the new one. You think back to even in the days when we were trying to get off of paper appointment books. It's a prime example, right?
I remember those days.
Right? And there's a lot of people that are still paper. I did a workshop at WVC this year, at Viticus, and I was amazed at how many paper, like non-computerized practices that came to that. I just didn't realize there were so many, I guess, out there yet, but they are there of all different kinds. But really thinking about how that all kind of plays, and back to the appointment book, I had a clinic, and this was many, many moons ago, right? Where the practice manager wanted to go to computerization, and the staff was balking. So he devised a plan to have them run both at the same time for a little while. And he said, you have to do it. So they agreed. And so he went in after a week and he took the paper book away from them. And they all kind of freaked out. And he said, but if you held up your end of the bargain, everything's in the computer as well, right? And they're like, well, yeah. He's like, great, you get to go another week with just the computer and then we'll see where we're at. And he came back after a week. He gave them the appointment book and they threw it in the trash. It was just leaving that security blanket or whatever. But it's really about diving in and looking at what things need to be trained and then kind of organizing and making sure they stay on task.
Yeah, some old school veterinarians like myself sometimes are a little reticent to try something in a different way or try something new. But at this point in time, computers, technology, software, it's no longer new. It is here to stay. It is commonplace. So when you're thinking about enhancing what you may already have, if you love your software, but there's maybe some of those gaps, how would you go about starting to look for solutions for those?
So much in the same way that I suggest my practices look at software, right? We make it a
Mhm.
very data-driven process. So sitting down with this key staff that's involved and saying, okay, what types of things are we needing to put a stopgap in where technology is concerned? Whether that's a whiteboard, maybe it's additional training. Doesn't always have to be a new piece of anything. It could be training on what you have already. Maybe it's a client communication tool that you're not using today, but figure that out and then just start researching the different ones that are available and getting those check boxes done. The check boxes give you a very visual on who can do what with what you want to do. Keeping in mind, if you want it to integrate, you need to have that as one of the check boxes, right? To
For
make
sure.
sure that it is going to work with whatever you already have in place.
So if somebody wanted to have a consultant potentially hold their hand and help them work through this information, who might you recommend?
I could probably help with that.
Tell me more. Where would people find you?
So I have a website. It's Nancy DeWitz, Nancy DeWitz, LLC.com, and it's NancyDeWitz, LLC.com. So you can find me on that. You can find me at the Nancy DeWitz LLC on my Facebook page. And I'm also in LinkedIn. So lots of different ways that they can reach out to me, and I'm happy to help.
Excellent. And we'll post that information for you, Nancy, along with the post for this podcast. That way, any of our listeners can certainly find you quickly, but also pass your information along.
Great.
All right. Well, we have had a great conversation. I learned so much. Thank you so much, Nancy, for joining us today and talking to us about kind of that review of software, as well as some things to look forward to in the future. We appreciate it very much.
Oh,
I
thank
also
you
want
for
to,
having me.
oh, of course, anytime. You can come back anytime and tell me more about software. I'm sure things are going to change pretty quickly now. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our listeners. We appreciate each and every one of you. We cannot do what we do without you. If you like our podcast, kindly share it with your colleagues and friends on social media. Also, please don't forget to leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your reviews will help us find other veterinarians, veterinary technicians, veterinary nurses, veterinary assistants, practice owners, medical directors, hospital managers, and customer service representatives. So until next time, keep striving for excellence and making a positive impact in the lives of your patients and pet parents. Nancy, I wish you, as well as all of our listeners, an amazing week ahead.